Hi, this is the video for Tuesday, January 12th for 11th grade English. Today, we're still looking at the Civil War in memory. We're really focused on Robert E. Lee even more. I'm going to take us through some of the parts of the war that ended it, and then Reconstruction, which started after the war was over. We'll end with a text that Lee wrote himself. So it's a continued focus on Robert E. Lee, but really this time in the context of the fact that the South lost the war. We'll begin class by filling out this group note-taking guide, and I'll open it now and do it for you on this camera, and then I'll delete it for class today. We're trying to collect our thoughts so that when it's time to write the précis and you have to pick two of these texts, you have a lot of good notes that you can use with possible claims. So today we're looking backwards to what we did yesterday for our homework, and you were to read chapter 6 of the Killer Angels. Chapter 6 was all through the perspective of Robert E. Lee. So what are some claims you can make that you found in that chapter? And I'll come up with a few. None of these are the only one, but you do need to think of something that is a strong statement that you find underneath the language or between the lines of the voice of Robert E. Lee. So I'll say Robert E. Lee acted decisively, which is why he was a great leader. Okay, I'll add another claim. Lee believed in old-fashioned warfare. That's another claim we can make. I'll do a little think aloud for you. I'm reflecting on the chapter and how the internal monologue is written. And a lot of it is really religious. He justifies the death that he asks of his soldiers and even of himself with a really strong faith in God and as he calls it, the presence. There's a lot of that comes through this. There's a strong sense of fidelity or loyalty to his subordinates, and I want to say something about that. So when I get into the parts about Stuart, the young cavalry officer who makes a big mistake, Lee is really firm with him, like a father. He is strong in his language for condemning Stuart, but when Stuart tries to resign, he says, "There is no time for that. There is a fight tomorrow. We need you." So I want to capture that idea too. Trusted, if I could spell trusted. Trusted his subordinate. Subordinate is just a word that means someone who's underneath you in the chain of command. Okay, 3 different claims. For your paragraph, you would only choose one, or you would think of a new one. One claim is all you can support in a paragraph. Trying to give us a lot of different things to choose from, though. Support for those claims. So the first one, acted decisively. He says in the back of his mind, he knew what he would do. So I want to capture that idea with my support. And then he believed in old-fashioned warfare, decided to attack and not withdraw the way Longstreet wanted him to. That's support for that argument. Trusted his subordinates. So I'll say the way he treated Stuart. And I'll say dialogue, because I go to that dialogue and I'll find examples if I choose that for my paragraph. Purpose. So what is the purpose of this first idea? That he acted decisively. In the back of his mind, he knew what he would do, to show Lee for his most beloved characteristics. We have to somehow try to figure out, well, what made this guy so well loved and honored? So that would be the purpose, I think, of this. The second idea, he believed in old-fashioned warfare, decided to attack and not withdraw. What's the purpose of that? I think the purpose here that Shara is trying to point out is to reveal Lee's mistake, that his inability or unwillingness to think about this new trench warfare that Longstreet was pushing resulted in the loss. And then lastly, he trusted his subordinates, the way he treated Stuart. And I think the purpose of this is to reveal his character and the trust he developed. Show why he was loved. All right, the audiences. So the audience for the first, who is it that needs to understand how beloved Lee was? And I think the audience is anybody who's trying to understand the legacy of Lee. We're going to talk about monuments for the rest of the week, and Lee will come up a lot. So for anyone who's trying to understand, what is this guy? Why is it such a big deal to people that there be monuments to him? We have to think about one side of that equation. There's another side that we'll consider this week. And then who's the audience for this second claim that he might have made a mistake at Gettysburg? No, I think that's more military historians or people interested in military tactics. And then lastly, why do we need to know how he treated his staff? I think this is similar to anyone who wants to understand. All right. So the spirit of the work that we're doing today, it's all about this. It's all about trying to understand and analyze the texts a little bit further. And with that in mind, let's move to another text. So the slides that will get us there are just trying to understand what happened in the war. First, the North won. The North won in April of 1865, a couple of years after Gettysburg, so it took some time. It resulted in resentment, bitterness from the South towards the North, and from the South towards African Americans who are now freed from slavery. There was a tense existence during Reconstruction between the now freed Black people living in the South and the white people who are still living in the South, looking at the carnage that had devastated their land and looking at the institution that their land rested upon now being stripped away. There's also bitterness from the North to the South. This had been a costly war, and the victors came to occupy the South. By no means was that a harmonious agreement. As a result of all of this, political and economic control of the South returned to white people after Reconstruction. And it returned to, in many cases, the same people who had been leaders before or connected to the leaders before. So short-lived Reconstruction. We'll get into that a little bit, though, with here, the next slides. So the economic and political gains of former slaves proved to be temporary. Here you have the first African-American senators and representatives to Congress. So immediately, Black people found themselves finally having representation in the political body of the land. It's just that changed pretty fast, and they were relegated back to a place in society that continued to uphold white supremacy. Lincoln was leader for a little while longer after the war before he was assassinated. Because secession was illegal, Confederate governments in the southern states, led by, for example, Jefferson Davis, were illegitimate, and therefore, in Lincoln's view, the states had never really left the Union. It had all been a disagreement, but not a formal division. And the idea that the U.S. was one indivisible nation had prevailed. So Lincoln wanted to use Reconstruction to restore the legitimate state governments that were loyal to the Union and to heal some of these wounds. He said, the federal government shouldn't punish the South, but to act with malice toward none, charity for all, and to bind up the nation's wounds. There was also a good amount of pressure to create a very, or at least more, safe and equal life for free Black people in the South. But then Lincoln was assassinated just a few days after the surrender. And all of that hung in the balance. The Confederate States were not allowed to come back into the Union immediately, were put under military occupation, and now the leader was here, Andrew Johnson. Let's go back a couple of slides here. Andrew Johnson clashed with the Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans was their name. It's not my adjective. Clashed with them about a lot of things, including especially voting rights and the civil rights that the Radical Republicans wanted to extend to freed Blacks in the South and implement for Blacks in the North as well. So they fought, and eventually they actually impeached Andrew Johnson, which did not result in a conviction and did not remove him from office, but represented just how much antagonism there was at this time and during Reconstruction. So there are 3 amendments that are passed during Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th ensured equal rights under the law, and the 15th guaranteed voting rights for anybody, regardless of color or race or previous condition of servitude. Notice it doesn't say women. That would come later. But that it exists in the Constitution does not necessarily mean it is freely and equally enforced. And that is where the South ended in 1877. Not to mention the North. Racism persisted in all places in America. The Compromise of 1877 ended the military occupation of the South, so they were back to their own leaders. It restored leadership for some people who had lost power, and it opened the door for the Jim Crow era, which began a long period where African Americans in the South, and indeed the North, were denied the full rights of American citizenship. Particularly in the South, the now free Black people were sometimes terrorized by white people, white citizens, to preserve white supremacy. There were many lynchings, and there was violent voter suppression to keep the vote firmly entrenched in the hands of the power structures that existed before the Civil War, before Reconstruction. What does Robert E. Lee think about all this? I think everybody probably looked to him for guidance, for leadership in this time, hoping that he would have some words of wisdom for how to conduct themselves after losing the war, looking for ways through the fight. And I think he shows us that in this response. So during the period of Reconstruction, there were already attempts to memorialize fallen soldiers. Robert E. Lee was invited to Gettysburg after the war to commemorate the battle, and this is what he wrote. This is a text that you can use for your précis. Dear Sir, he writes, absence from Lexington has prevented my receiving until today your last letter, enclosing an invitation from the Battle of Gettysburg Memorial Association to attend a meeting of the officers engaged at that battle for the purpose of marking upon the ground by enduring memorials of granite the positions and movements of the armies on the field. My engagements will not permit me to be there. I believe if there, I could not add anything important to the information that already exists on the subject. I think it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the example of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings were created. Respectfully, Robert E. Lee. So that last sentence there, last full sentence, is really astounding. I think it's wiser not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the example of nations who have obliterated, completely erased the memory of civil war, to commit to oblivion, forget the feelings that were created. In his opinion, the monuments would just create more and more of that sore opening up. I also find this last line amazing here in the first paragraph. I think if I were there, I couldn't add anything important on the subject. What humility. So today, your kernel sentence is Lee moved on. We also, at the end of class, added to our group note-taking document, added this row about Lee's letter. So you can review that as well, just to see how you could use it for your précis. And that's it.